What's going on, guys? In this one we're just going to be going through a little DIY guide of how to build a closed terrarium. First things first, here's what you're going to need to get started. Now obviously you're going to want to make sure you have a container picked out. I got these 3 from Costco for like 20 bucks. Whatever you use, make sure they're sealable. Then you're going to want something for a drainage layer. I've got Leca here. You could also use gravel. I'll be using some window screen mesh to break up my drainage layer and my substrate, but for a simpler solution you can always use some filter foam. For the substrate I'll be using a mix of sphagnum moss, orchid bark, as well as some cocoa fiber. First, we're going to get this drainage layer in of Leca. For this small terrarium, I'm just going to use like 1 cup, probably about 1 or 2 inches thick. The point of this is just to have a place for the water to drain so it's not sitting in the substrate. If you don't have a drainage layer, that dirt is going to get all nasty, end up being a lot like the bottom of a pond, which is not what you want in a closed terrarium. Now we're just using this window screen mesh as a barrier in between the substrate and the drainage layer. Again, a simpler solution to this is just replace this window screen mesh and the drainage layer with filter foam. You can cut that out in the shape of a circle and put that at the bottom of the terrarium. That works great too. But for this I like to have the look of the drainage layer as well as the substrate in there. So I just got this cut, that way it lays fairly flat in there. It doesn't have to be perfect, just keep most of that substrate out of that layer. So you can see kind of what that looks like in there. Nothing too fancy, but it'll do the job. The next step is going to be getting this substrate mixed up. I have these condensed dried out sphagnum moss that I'm going to rehydrate here, so I'll just let that soak while I get the rest of this mixed in. So we'll get a little bit of orchid bark in there. A good chunk of the base is also going to be this cocoa fiber. These are both just great biological things that will kind of slowly break down, provide some nutrients for this system. A little bit more live moss in there, as well as this sphagnum moss that I just rehydrated. So we'll get some water added, get this all mixed together. You can just use regular dirt if you want to just grab some from outside, but I like to use this mix. The sphagnum moss keeps it a little bit airier. That sphagnum moss will keep a lot of hydration in that substrate as well. The next thing I'll throw in here is just going to be some activated carbon. This is going to act as a little bit of a filter for any of the water that is dropping down and then evaporating in the system, kind of clean out a lot of impurities for it. So we'll mix a little bit into the substrate here, and then I'll get a little layer on top of this window screen mesh, and then I'll pour a bit of a layer of that charcoal on before adding the rest of this substrate. So we'll get enough in there that things can burrow a bit, roots can grow into, but not too much because we still want a little bit of airspace for the plants to grow into as well. The next thing we're going to add is Springtails. So I've got a little colony on this charcoal and water with a little bit of rice. So we're just going to pour a few of them in here. If you're not familiar with Springtails, they're essentially just tiny bugs that are going to eat the mold and mildew that grow inside the terrarium. So these are the things that are going to break down all those things that typically ruin a closed terrarium, turn them back into nutrients for the system to use again and again. So they make a really big difference on smaller terrariums. So I'd highly recommend getting a small colony of these and learning how to breed them so you can put them into your setups. Next, we just got to grab some plants. So I ran to Lowe's, grabbed just a few things that weren't too expensive, tried to find some stuff that is going to grow well with consistently wet soil. So we got a little bit of moss, a fern, and then kind of a vine. Just a little bit different textures. I'll throw the names of the plants up here on the screen. For the moss, I tried to pull some out with a few roots attached. As well, I took some clippings off the top, just because when you cut up moss into smaller pieces, it helps it grow a little bit faster. So we'll get that pressed down into the soil. Then with that fern, they had some runners that were going out along the top, so I just grabbed part of those and I'll get that planted in there as well. And then same with the vines. We'll get some pulled out with the roots, and then I'll take some clippings just off the edge of one, just as a bit of an experiment to see if that will grow or not. So we'll get everything pressed in here. First we'll get that fern with that runner just planted in the soil, get that pressed around. Then we'll get these vines with some solid roots kind of tucked in. We're just pressing the substrate around kind of the root structure, making sure that stays wet and they've got some stuff to grow into. Then we're just sprinkling some of these moss clippings on top, getting those pressed down for the same reason. Then we'll get some moss with some of those roots tucked towards this back corner. And then we'll get a little more water added just to make sure those don't dry out. Obviously this is a pretty simple setup, but hopefully it gave you an idea of what you needed to build your own closed terrarium. Most important things being a sealable container, as well as that drainage layer and a solid layer of substrate, just so everything can stay healthy. And then make sure you're getting those springtails in. And as long as you make sure you have those few things, you should have a decent amount of success getting these set up, and then you can learn as you go. But that's going to be a wrap on this one, guys. Thanks for watching, and make sure you tune in for videos in the future.